of Big Picture, we will analyze the status of Indo-Japan ties in the backdrop of the Japanese Prime Minister's visit to India. Joining me on the program today are Ambassador Rajhiv Bhatia, former diplomat. Also with me on the program is Professor Srabani Choudhury, who is part of the Center for East Asian Studies, School of International Studies, JNU, and Pramit Choudhury, foreign editor of the Hindustan Times. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of Big Picture. Ambassador, I'd like to start the program with you first. Let's first analyze the key takeaways and the key highlights of the Japanese Prime Minister's visit to India.
There are several points of salience or importance about this visit. First of all, the gap preceding this event, the last summit took place in 2018. So there was beginning this perception that, kind of distance was growing between the two countries. So this has been remedied effectively. On the second aspect, I think it's important that as in the past, the focus very much was on both the regional and international aspects as well as the bilateral aspect. So there was a composite integrated view that was adopted. And I think thirdly, there are a number of new initiatives which have been taken. I think one that comes to one's mind immediately is the one concerning the Northeast, the Sustainable Development Initiative. Another one which strikes one very clearly is the Green Energy Initiative. So the idea is to focus on the bigger picture, but also come up with very specific initiatives which are backed by an enhanced assurance by Japan to invest more in India. So overall, it looks like a good successful visit.
Absolutely, a good successful visit is how the ambassador is calling it. Srabani Choudhury, I'd like to come to you now, and let's talk about this other aspect of under Prime Minister Abe. We saw that the ties between India and Japan reached new heights. It was a great partnership that we had. Has that continued on now with the new Prime Minister as well?
Yeah, let me just remind the audience that, Kishida has been the foreign minister before he's today come back as a prime minister. During his tenure as a foreign minister, they had inked India-Japan Vision 2025. So he's not new to this entire job. And I think if you look at the Vision 2025 and what has been delivered at the economic level in the current summit, you see a huge linkages in it, because he had then at that point of time, there was definite identification of reduction of carbon, green energy, renewable energy, digitalization. If you look at that, and if you look at today's summit meet and its joint statement, you see a huge amount of similarity. And therefore, at the economic front, I think we've almost, ridden the same wave as what was, I think, formulated by probably even Koizumi in his 8 initiatives that he had given us in 2006. And therefore, I think we are in a fairly, smooth road as far as the economic cooperation and the dimensions that have been created in the new frontiers, I think, gives us a good opportunity to use our bilateral relationships in the way forward with respect to economic cooperation.
Absolutely. Pramit, coming to you now, India and Japan have been working together, when it comes to various sectors, various areas. And like the ambassador was mentioning as well, it's time to focus on some specific aspects and try and take the relationship forward to another level as well. So how do we do that? And what is the status of these projects that we are working on together?
Well, the biggest project, which precedes, obviously, Prime Minister Kishida's visit, is the bullet train between Ahmedabad and Mumbai. That's well behind schedule. But when I've talked to Japanese officials, they're pretty philosophical about this. They said even the Tokyo to Osaka super connectivity corridor is also behind schedule because of exactly the same problem, which is land acquisition. And of course, we right now have to also persuade the new government and the Shiv Sena government in Maharashtra that this is still to their benefit. But these projects are slow. But the idea behind the first bullet train project is somewhat like the Delhi Metro project, to show that it can actually be done in India. Because a lot of Indians, I know even at the highest level, are actually skeptical that India could actually ever build a bullet train and have it functional. But once it's running, the benefits are so overwhelming. The assumption is that we'll get a lot more public and political support at the local level for it. So that's obviously there. I think the big highlight for me of the Kishida visit is a massive concentration and focus on the green energy transition. This is something obviously that's part of almost every aid or investment package we receive now from the world, but the amount of money that Japanese have put up, in this case, $42 billion over 5 years, plus that's in addition to the concessional loans and aid and other projects that are still already there. But what you're looking at is a recognition that things like the green batteries are really the future of international energy security. And if many ways, I remember us talking to a former very senior US official. He says the goal of every country now in terms of energy is to be green hydrogen superpower, because that's where the future is going. So here you actually have an enormous number of investments, both private and public, being put forward by Japan to get that project through, because our biggest obstacle India faces is simply where is the finance going to come from for such an enormous endeavor. And this is really a huge down payment, if you wish. But correctly, the Japanese argue, you've got to get a lot of private investment. Government money is simply not going to ever be enough for genuine green transition in India or anywhere else. So I think that's really the biggest thing that Kishida brought into the picture. And he's combined that with the supply chain resilience initiative, with the Quad, and various other projects or agreements that we have with the Japanese. Finally, we don't have too much forward movement on the strategic side, partly because a lot of what we're doing on the strategic side is essentially defined by cutting edge technology and so on. But one of the things the Japanese have put forward, again, something that's mentioned in the Quad documents, is where do we go on the next generation telecom infrastructure? This incorporates two elements. One, undersea cables, where you see a lot of Japanese companies already beginning the process of building new cable networks for us or with us in the Indian Ocean. And second, 6G. I mean, 5G, we're already there, if you wish. And the Japanese and the Americans have one program. We have our own 5GI, which incorporates a number of other different countries. But they're saying countries are moving into 6G development, and we're prepared to work with India on that front.
Absolutely. Ambassador, coming back to you now, since we are talking about, the partnership between Japan and India, we are also looking at collaborating and looking at trilaterals as well with other countries. Now, what kind of projects can we work on? How are both India and Japan going to help other countries and help ourselves too in the process?
Well, this is, in my view, a problem area, and I don't think the document that was issued on 19th has very clear or cogent answers. We recall that it was during Prime Minister Abe's time that India and Japan launched Asia-Africa Growth Corridor. Some of us in the media and strategic community circles got so taken in by it that we neglected to note that at some stage the Japanese had actually pulled out of it. And as a result, for a while, the think tanks continued to move forward on it as if nothing has happened. But eventually, nothing much happened, essentially because there was not sufficient political will from Tokyo onto it. Now, of late, there is an attempt, through the business channels to try to move that forward. But going beyond Africa, I think the potential definitely remains in terms of collaboration between the two countries, because Japan has finance and technology, and India has management expertise, and also technology of the kind that the target constituencies need, whether it is South Asia or Indochina or parts of Africa or even the Pacific Islands. So something has been missing, as a result of which the trilateral cooperation excites us, the think tankers, more than the policy makers and the business leaders. I think that needs to change. But I want to also fundamentally say that there is so much of collaboration that still can be forged between India and Japan beyond the trilateral. And I hope we will come to those strategic issues later. Thank you.
Absolutely. No, since we're here, let's talk about that as well, Ambassador. Let's address that too. We're talking about strategic issues. Of course, we are part of several multilaterals together. Quad is one of the biggest ones, of course, that it's in the news. We all seem to be talking about the Quad. Quad seems like the flavor of the season. So, from a strategic point of view as well, what really can be done, and where do we stand?
Very briefly, because we have very distinguished panelists here, I think one of the key highlights of this visit was to prepare and pave the road to Tokyo summit of the Quad. I think I agree with Professor Srabani completely. We have in the present Prime Minister a former foreign minister, so he's master of his dossier, and I'm sure he has had very close consultations with our leaders. The road to the Quad is being prepared. Now, Quad is facing once again a kind of a credibility crisis. Having done 3 summits in the past, let us say, year or so, and it has raised so many expectations that Tokyo has this big challenge as to how to fulfill at least part of them, or to be seen to be fulfilling part of them. Now, one interesting and important clue to my mind came in the document that was issued on Saturday, relates to South China Sea, and the need that the 2 leaders agreed on for a very substantive and comprehensive code of conduct. As we know, the code of conduct is being negotiated by China and the ASEAN countries. China does not want anybody else to be involved or even to talk about it, but that is not acceptable to all of us, because all the nations have to use those waters. They are international waters. So it will be very interesting to see how the Quad adheres to its commitment for this whole business of maritime security and free and open Indo-Pacific in terms of the maritime domain. I think we should scrutinize and watch it closely.
Absolutely. Professor, coming back to you now, so since we are here, we are talking about some of these key areas, key aspects and areas of improvement as well. So are there any, as far as ties between India and Japan are concerned, are there any problem areas of concern where you think that need immediate addressing?
Concerns have always remained at various levels, whether it was trade or investment into our country. We've always found ourselves, not the first country, first mover from the Japan point of view. One, of course, has been the issue of trade in trade. If you look at it, we have the CEPA in place, etc. But however, we've not been able to penetrate Japanese market because of their strictness with respect to quality and other non-tariff issues that they have. That is with trade. With investment, I think it has not only been a question of whether foreign investment is attractive. We become attractive to Japanese. JETRO surveys talk about us being in the long run, India being the number 1. However, if you see ground reality, even the startup companies, if you look at it today, we've not got the substantial investment as, say, Indonesia or Vietnam has got, especially when Japan started to de-link from China, which has been a big momentum that has been given by the Japanese government with respect to giving them subsidies to move out. So if you look at investment also, there are problems and we've been tackling it. We've had the Indo-Japan desk, we've created the Act East Forum. So at policy level, there's lots of good, strong initiative to encourage Japanese investment. And I think the current decade, as we are looking at we finished the 70th decade and we're talking about the next decade, I think next decade will be how we can, at the ground level, implement and get the Japanese to look at us in the bigger picture. As far as at the policy level, if you look at it, we've created a large number of working groups. We've been integrating ourselves with their technology, especially in critical technologies, digitalization, robotics, and AI. We've created good body of research R&D groups. Indian scientists are really considered to be, one of the world leaders as far as working on innovations, etc. And I think Japanese have understood that working with us would be very good. And we have the outer space also, which has been brought in with our between JASA and our ISRO. So we have lots of potentially good policies that has been created or working groups that has been created. However, the problems are sometimes, like say in Shinkansen, we have our own land acquisition issues, we have a bureaucratic red tapeism. All these continues to be a problem. But I think there are enough platforms now where we can negotiate these problems with them. And they have also understood that in the case of India, it is not something that they can do a copy paste of what they did in Thailand or in Philippines. That cannot happen in India. We are diverse, we have different challenges, and those challenges have to be understood and negotiated. I think that has been a huge move that has happened in the last decade between India and Japan's relations.
Absolutely. And Pramit, since you're here, so what are the key focus areas for both India and Japan going forward?
In fact, I had a long discussion with a member of the Prime Minister's office, Kishida's office, recently. And he said basically, look, these are the areas that we are looking at. One, third country cooperation is still very much alive. The Africa corridor died largely because China sabotaged the Kenyan corridor. The Mozambican corridor is now coming back to life because India has just purchased the so-called Nacala corridor from the Brazilian company that initially had picked it up. It's now just been bought by Jindal Coal. And so we are there. We'll see whether the Japanese are interested in coming back onto that. Sri Lanka, of course, has been difficult because the Sri Lankan government sabotaged almost every single project the Japanese did. The Rajapaksas undermined 3 major projects the Japanese were going to do. Now the Rajapaksas are regretting that. And the Japanese have said, we're not helping you and you can stew in the present crisis you have. But the lesson has been learned by other countries. So in the Maldives and Mauritius, Seychelles, you're seeing a lot greater welcome. The Japanese have been very successful in Bangladesh. With a lot of the projects they're working on, many of which are done in at least coordination with us, if not necessarily ventures. But the really big Japanese push is in the northeast of India to build connectivity between the northeast, Myanmar, and Bangladesh. Myanmar, of course, is a bit of a headache right now because it's in a quasi-civil war. But a lot of the projects between the northeast and Bangladesh are being done between us and the Japanese. The Quad continues to be a slow work in progress because it's somewhat unique. It tries to, its core is not about strategic cooperation in things like the military and diplomatic field, though that's there. It's really all about strategic technologies. So there is it's unusual for countries to do that type of thing in the nature that the way the Quad is doing, because it has to incorporate an enormous degree of private sector. Governments are not going to be able to lead the way in quantum computing or artificial intelligence and so on. They have to buy in various, bring in and crowd in the private sector of their companies. That's big, that has slowly happening. Of the 20 plus working groups now that the Quad has, about 5 or 6 of them are doing relatively well. And the hope the Japanese have is that when Kishida takes over or officially hosts the next Quad summit, they will be able to announce some progress in some of them. Some of the other Quad programs, notably the vaccine, the COVID vaccine program, is running aground not largely because within the Indo-Pacific area, demand for the COVID vaccine has dropped off. We've given out 500 million plus. But after that, there's been a question of who's going to take it. And the question, I think, really is to expand that coverage to Africa, where there is still enormous demand for COVID vaccines. And yes, Kishida did raise a couple of issues which were rejected by the Indian side. Particularly, he wants the Quad, the US and Australia, want the Quad to take a stronger position on the war in the Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. There, India has basically said that's simply not what the Quad should be looking at, because the Quad is Indo-Pacific and it's still too early, if you wish, to do that. And so I know that he didn't get much coverage. The Japanese also continue to push for us to reconsider RCEP, the big trade or a thing that incorporates China, which we walked out of. And Indian government is very firm. They will not join any multilateral or plurilateral trade organization that gives China additional access to the Indian market. So that's also no longer, that has not been on the cards, but Japan continues to hope that we will consider it. And they've built in a clause into the RCEP that allows us to join in as a founding member anytime we wish to do so. But that's not going to be happening in a hurry either. So some of those areas we're not seeing forward progress. I think Japan slowly will have to give up on those. But again, the broad Japanese game of trying to build up Indians' economic capacities and move forward and make us, if you wish, a more powerful balancer to China and a source of profits for eventually for their companies. So that continues to be at the heart of what they're doing. And Kishida's chip indicates that there's a complete consensus on that. There's no difference between his policy and, let's say, Abe's policy on that front.
Absolutely. All right. Time to get quick closing comments now with the best way forward and what next when it comes to ties between India and Japan, starting first with you, Ambassador.
I'd like to make 2 or 3 quick points, keeping in mind what probably has not been covered yet. First of all, in terms of India's Indo-Pacific strategy, a major measure of importance is given to IPOI, Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative. This has recognized 7 specific sectors, and India has been looking for countries to be serving as lead countries. Now, in this context, it is important to note that Japan has already been our partner for this project, and they have been given a very important sector, the connectivity sector, as part of this maritime initiative. So here our hope and expectation should be that both sides, both governments will start moving beyond holding academic seminars and start talking to the business and maritime communities, so that that connectivity gets actually reflected in a real life. I mean, I'm not at all obviously against any academic interactions, but the whole thing should not stop there. Academic ideas should spur cooperation at the business and industry level. That is my first point. The second point, I think I want to highlight, this obsession of some of us in media about how India and Japan disagree on Ukraine. In reality, there is no such thing. Obviously there is disagreement about the way we look at war and the question of condemnation of Russia. That is not India's culture and that is not India's diplomacy. But on the rest of these segments, there is a considerable convergence, and this was reflected in the document. So Ukraine is not any kind of a dark shadow on India-Japan relationship that it is made out to be. And my third and last point relates to Myanmar. I have reason to believe that the officials on both sides and the leaders, they have discussed closely the respective approaches in Myanmar. I think there is considerable scope for the two countries to work together along with 1 or 2 countries from ASEAN, so that at this time, when the world's attention is largely focused on Europe, these 3 or 4 countries that understand the local situation can actually move forward and contribute to trying to normalize the situation in Myanmar.
Absolutely. Srabani?
Since, Ambassador has covered a bit on larger notions of strategic and security concerns, I will limit myself to looking at what would be the takeaways that one can have from the economic part of it. What is very interesting is in the joint statement they talked about sustainable development. And I think this is where the world focuses, and this is where the bilateral relations focus would move. Critical technologies sector would be, again, in focus, And we would probably see a lot more engagement with Japan with respect to critical technologies, especially digitalization, as Pramit has said about 6G. And Japan has something called Society 5.0, which has got an integration of digitalization as well as sustainable development model. And I think this is where we will pick up in our smart cities, etc. The other place where I think a huge economic development focus would be is in the Northeast Asia, India, where because of the connectivity issue. Infrastructure development in Northeast would not only promote connectivity of that region to the Myanmar, Bangladesh, and thereof headway, gateway to Indo-Pacific, but I think it would also make a huge difference to our country's using of resources, and sustainable development model can be begin at that region and probably find ways into the plains of India. The third thing I think where we would see a lot of engagement between India and Japan in economic developmental projects with respect to, as has been mentioned, that Quad is all about using developmental models and technology into embedding and increasing the national power through technology. I think that would be one area that India and Japan will concentrate, especially with blue economy also coming into picture. You have the Blue Dot Network, you Build Better World concept also that has come in. I think these are the areas which would be new dimensions that would open up. And since it's beginning of the year and we've just had one summit, we have a Tokyo's Quad summit coming in, we'll see a lot of linkages that would be developed through the 20 working groups in Quad to what would happen in the bilateral engagements with India and Japan.
Absolutely. And Pramit, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
Yeah, I think as has been mentioned, all of these governments recognize there's a new geopolitical order, if you wish, and particularly the battle over strategic domination of strategic technologies in many ways is at the heart of a lot of this geopolitical struggle. The Quad, AUKUS, the new Quad that we built with the UAE and Israel, the technology elements are in many ways the most important parts of them. And Japan and India already working closely on a lot of that. They recognize the importance and they're trying to figure out how to get these things right. The Japanese acknowledge that India's manpower, not just in IT, but in generally in technical spheres, is essential to their capacities and to the capacities of any ex-China coalition of countries, which is one of the reasons we now have, if I'm correct, 13 Japanese skilling centers for manufacturing skilling centers in India. And I think they're planning to add another 5 to handle the problem, especially in North India, of the lack of skilled manpower for manufacturing purposes. And the Quad fellowships, which are designed to produce STEM students or promote STEM studies in all 4 countries. But we know that the bulk of those will end up going to Indian students simply because of the numbers involved. And going back to the issue of the green transition, in green energy is one of the strategic technologies where China is well ahead of all of the other Quad members. It's actually lags behind in many of the other areas. But in this area, whether making the electrical batteries, solar modules, so on, so all of this area of China is really top of the hill, and that's one of the key reasons why you saw Senator John Kerry, the special envoy for Biden on climate change, announce a special green finance coalition to help India. You see now Kishida come in with this enormous aid package. All of this is driven by the need that this is one area that you have to make a lot of extra effort to catch up with China, forget about exceeding China. And India is in many ways, Prime Minister Modi is one of the most ambitious world leaders and supporters of green transition. He sees that quite clearly as where India must go, and he recognizes, the government recognizes, that if we don't green our steel production, green our power production, we will not a question of whether it affects the climate and it affects our domestic environment. We will not be able to export that steel anywhere because the new tariff structures and trade structures were basically designed to keep out dirty steel and carbon tariffs are going to be the basis of future trade. So we have to be ready for that. And that's one of the things that Japan will be probably the most important partner in helping us get to that point.
Absolutely. All right. We'll have to leave it at that. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and bring things into perspective for us. Thank you so much.